Hello everyone, JTB Animations here, or Joltable Animations, or NMs, whichever you prefer, and this is the very first video in this tutorials playlist. Now, originally I had a lot I wanted to cram into this one video, but I decided it'd be better to just start off with, say, 10 tips that I've learned over the last 5 years. So, without further ado, I'm going to be listing off them now, so you can skip to the spot in the video that I will list where I talk about those tips, depending on what you actually want to understand or learn about, as opposed to just watching them all through if you don't want to do that. Tip 1. Higher FPS does not equal a better animation. Tip 2. Export format does matter. Tip 3. Quality is always better than quantity. Tip 4. You don't have it? Make it. Tip 5. When in doubt, constructive criticism. Tip 6. Editing, sure, but think about it first. Tip 7. Collaboration. Tip 8. Community. Tip 9. Burnout. Tip 10. Transparency. Starting off with tip 1. Higher FPS does not equal a better animation. Now I'll show up on the screen here what a high FPS animation looks like. Ironically, when I first started animation, I jumped straight to 30 FPS, assuming the best way to make a high quality animation was to have as many frames as possible. That was a big mistake. The higher your FPS, the more room there is for you to make a weird looking frame or to not have things lined up, and it can make things look a bit off because there will be a single frame worth of jerk. When it comes to frames per second, there's a fine line between having too many frames and not enough frames. The lower your FPS, the more choppy movements will look. Things will not move as quickly, things may not flow as you would like them to, and if you have too many frames, things might go too slow or look unreal. Which is why a lot of my earlier animations look synthetic. They look wrong, because it's done at way too high of an FPS, and that makes it look like it's done robotically. Ironically, I had a lot of people in the early days accusing me of using tweening, which is ironic because Pivot 4 and Pivot 3 never had tweening. Only Pivot 5 does, which, by the way, you can download at the link in the description. I'll probably just show it up on the screen here. And that is the newest version. However, you won't be getting the versions that I am using because I'm a beta tester, haha. But that's not going to stop you from being able to follow this tutorial because it'll all be version 5. Right now, I use a mix of 18 FPS and 30 FPS. Now you're probably thinking, I literally just said you shouldn't use 30 FPS. Well, yes and no. Depending on what you actually want your animation to be, is how you should actually determine what FPS you want it to be at. If you're just doing a normal stick figure animation, I'd say 18 to 24 FPS is a good middle. 24 FPS is a really solid option because it lets you go full speed on singles and make things a little bit slower but still fluid at doubles. Doubles means you have 2 frames with a single solid movement. So say you have an animation right here on this screen, you have this guy right here, and then you want him to move over here. There. Now if we bump this FPS up to 24 and we play it, it's very fast and hard to follow. But if we go every other frame and insert, each frame has a second one behind it that is the same, so when we play this, it's easier to see even if it's slower. I'll show another example of the difference between 24 FPS and 12 FPS on the screen. That's another thing I forgot to mention before. The higher the FPS, the longer it will take to make, because you have to focus more attention on each frame. I personally use a little trick to animate at a lower FPS and then boost to a higher FPS using in-betweens. I'll detail that in a later video, and I'll also pin it up in the top corner here so you can check that out. Alright, now for tip 2. Export format does matter. So we're just going to make a single frame animation here and head to export. We have 4 different options here. Animated GIF or GIF, whichever you prefer, animated PNG, video, and separate images. Now when you pick separate images, it basically takes every single frame that you make, for example, it makes every single one of those a single static PNG. Now that can be useful for importing into other software, say as SVJ files, and you put them into a Flash format or Flash software, which I don't do, but you can actually look at the Dark Demon YouTube channel where they detail that. It's a very useful tutorial. But that is a bit difficult because every time you export as a single PNG, you're then going to have to import every single PNG individually, which is a bit annoying. Next, we have the video format. This is the one you're going to use the most. When you click this option, it asks where you want to put it, and in my case, I'm just going to put it on my videos folder. You hit save, after naming it, of course, I almost forgot that. And then you get to this option. Obviously, you have the height here, and you have this little indicator, and then you also have all of this. Now, you guys might be missing a few things here. You might have a few extra things. That doesn't really matter. But mainly, you have these export options: Windows Media Video, WebM, Mega 4 or MP4, Lossless AVI, and Windows AVI. And then we have the bitrate, or kilobytes per second. This actually does matter. That actually ties into this tip. Your kilobytes per second, or bitrate per second, does actually determine how much detail is in your animation. Basically, a bit is the equivalent of a pixel. So the more bits you have, the more detail you have in the animation. The fewer bits, the less detail. Ironically, we have a limit of 5,000. If I set this to, say, 6, it would just default back to that. You can, however, set it to 3,000 or 300. 300, though, or anything under 1,000, is not going to look good at all. It's going to look like those, really, really pixelated video games. I would usually prefer around 3,000 for starters, and then once you actually export the entire file, then I would bump it up to 1,000. Now for these video formats, which ones you'd use, which ones you wouldn't. I have never used Windows Media Video. It's there, and you can use it, but I've never used it. I just realized this entire video, I had them on the wrong preset. That's so funny. Anyway, back to the video. WebM file, or I guess there's another way to pronounce that. I don't know what it is. I don't really care at this point. But WebM file, or WebM format, this is an interesting one. It's one of the more modern files made. It doesn't have full support on every single video player. For example, Discord can have trouble playing these sometimes, Twitter can have trouble playing these sometimes, and a few other things. Mostly though, it's the most up-to-date, so it's the one that will generally look better. One upside of the WebM file format is that it supports alpha channel, which for those of you wondering means it supports transparency. I'll get to that in tip 10. This is actually going to be one of your more standard file formats, at least for me, but there are multiple downsides. The first thing is, since it isn't a well-recognized format, it will be a bit finicky in some editing software. And sometimes it will rewrite itself to be longer in some places or shorter in others. Basically, a single frame will span several other frames, wiping them out. That, however, is not something I found an easy fix to, so usually when I export larger files, I use MP4. However, MP4 format does not support transparency. It does not support alpha channels. Specifically the Mega 4 here, because this is actually an older MP4 format, because the MP4 format is a protected property. It's owned by a company. So actually, Peter, the creator of Pivot Animator, can't actually get the rights to this software, can't use the newest version of the MP4 format. So we're stuck with this slightly older one. This, however, is the most solid. It will still export at the normal kilobyte rate stuff, and it unfortunately doesn't support transparency, but it does not have the same problem that I talked about with the WebM format. Next format is Lossless AVI 1, and this actually grays out the kilobytes per second thing. Why? Lossless AVI cuts out anything that would suppress the file size, which means Lossless AVI, the big downside is that it takes up a large amount of space. The most, actually. Lossless AVI more so than Windows AVI, because Windows AVI allows you to compress it, as opposed to Lossless AVI, which does not. Lossless AVI does not have the same issues as I mentioned in the WebM format. It does, however, support limited transparency. What that means is it does support alpha channel, but not as well as the WebM format, which can cause problems here and there. It can cause ghosting, where one frame kind of overlaps the other, kind of like with the WebM problem as well, but not as consistently or as obviously. And tip 3, quality over quantity. Now, you could just do a bunch of really cheap, really simple, just base stick figure animations and just crank those out, like sync them to, say, meme stuff. Like you could do the TikTok format, so to speak. You could take a bunch of little cheap animations, sync them to sound effects, to music, to funny audio, and just crank those out. You can definitely do that, and that would probably gain some attention. But the thing is, you would gain limited attention, which isn't a bad thing. But you wouldn't get long, consistent viewership. You wouldn't get people who are actually interested in seeing you grow as a creator, who are interested in seeing what you produce long term. They would only be interested in the small, quick laughs. Of course, there are many different options for coming up with detailed figures. I mean, this is Pivot after all. You can create almost anything. And when I mean almost anything, I mean almost anything you want. So when I say that you can create detailed near full body or full body figures in Pivot Animator, I am not joking. And I'm pretty sure you can already tell. Alright, tip number 4. Don't have it? Make it. Again, when we have a figure like this, very basic, very small, very limited, there is a lot that we can do with this. For example, we of course have the figure editor, which allows us to do a lot of different things. And as an example, very quick example of what we can do, we can take this head, make it a little bit bigger, like so. We can take the forearms, make those bigger, make these arms a little bit bigger, a little bit longer. And then we add feet, which is the fun part, because they can be basically any length that you want them. Then you go over here, you hit save, and you can say basic advanced figure. And then Control A to add to your animation, and boom, just like that, we have the basic figure and an advanced figure, just like that. And here's the fun part. If you go into this, and you want to remove that segment, you can delete that, drag it up, add it back to the animation, and now you don't have a middle section. You're probably thinking, well, that's a downside. Well, unless you know how to do this. That will be in another tutorial soon. But basically that takes out the middle section, which allows for more fluid movement. Basically for tip 4, if you have a figure that you want, but you don't have it, try and make it. We basically have an open system here where you can add 50,000 line segments to a single figure. So there is a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for you to go wild with your imagination and make as much as you want. Alright, tip number 5. When in doubt, constructive criticism. Now this is something I hear a lot. People will make an animation and then they'll be like, oh, I don't like it. I don't like it. Something's wrong about it, but I don't know what. And they just leave it at that. They just abandon it, they try to make something else, but then everything just feels off, and they don't know why. This is what I call the newbie paradox. Once you start something, and you just start by yourself, and you're alone on it, and you try to make something look right, it almost never looks right. But since you have no outside perspective, no third-person perspective, a chance to actually see what might be wrong and fix it, you don't progress. You just stay at the same level, just constantly in this loop of not liking what you make and constantly trying to improve it but not getting anywhere. At that point is when you need to actually get your animation out there. Not just keep it to yourself and hide it. That's the last thing you want to do. If you have an animation and you want to see if it's actually good or not, what you need to do is you need to give it to someone. You need to send the video out there. You need to post it on social media, send it to a friend, show it to a friend. Best yet is find an animation community and send it there. That way people can give you constructive criticism. Now here's an important thing. There's a fine line between down talk, antagonizing, and constructive criticism. Constructive criticism. The definition of constructive criticism is giving advice and criticism based on the assumption of improvement and not degradation. The simple English definition of that is basically telling someone what you see is wrong with the animation and giving advice as opposed to saying, you're bad, stop animating, ugh, terrible, ugh. Now see, people will hear that and take it personally. That is another newbie paradox. You'll hear people saying, oh, this animation is awful, what's wrong with you? How do you not have progress? Have you not done anything yet? Well, that is not true constructive criticism. That is just plain being rude. So, when people get that sort of thing, they usually think, oh, well, I might as well just not do this anymore, it's not worth it. That is the defeatist attitude that gets so many people off of a hobby. So when you ask for constructive criticism, always keep an open mind. Think, well, if someone obviously is just not being helpful, not offering advice, then you don't need to listen to that person because they're not trying to help you. They're just trying to make things worse. They're just trying to make you feel bad, or they're just annoyed because they see, oh, this person's actually doing something. But always keep in mind, people who actually offer advice, who actually say, this thing could be like that instead, or have you tried blank, this, and this, those people are actually trying to help you, and that is the kind of advice you listen to. Tip number 6, editing. Sure, but think about it. Now, this is something a lot of people ask me. They say, what software do you use to edit your videos? How do you add the sound effects? How do you do this? How do you do that? Well, a lot of people assume that this is done in application, and that's because Stick Notes, a mobile version of Pivot Animator that is fairly popular, has a pro version that allows you to add sound effects to your video directly. Pivot Animator, however, does not have that. That's why a lot of Pivot animations have no sound or just very badly dubbed in music. I would actually advise that you not use an editing software until you're ready. Why? Well, there are free options, especially on mobile, but a lot of them are either locked behind a paywall, or they hide features from you, or they limit what you can actually do unless you actually, watch a bunch of ads, which I know you don't want to do. I personally would advise trying out the free trial of Filmora, that is the software I use, and it is actually cheaper than most software. A lot of editing software Adobe actually locks everything behind a subscription service. So for you to use their editing software, you have to pay them a monthly, yearly, or something fee to actually use their software. Filmora, however, you can just get with a one-time purchase of $60. I mean, yeah, that's a good bit, but think about it, a one-time purchase of $60, and you get the base. What do I mean by base? Well, there are subscriptions that allow for higher quality exports, and I don't mean high quality as in UHD. I mean like 8K, 14K, and other things as such. It also allows for access to the resource library, which you don't necessarily need, because I used it for years without needing it, and other things. You, however, don't need all of those. If you're just adding sound effects or actually just exporting in HD or UHD, you don't really need the fancy subscription. Just because I'm using it doesn't mean you need it. So again, to recap, editing, sure, but think about it. Because $60 is $60, and if you don't want to completely commit to animation, you don't completely need to add animation at the end, because YouTube, if you're uploading on YouTube, actually allows you to add their own music to a video just in the background. It may not be synced perfectly, and it might not be what you want, but it's a good option if you actually want to add something to your animation without having to go through the whole editing hassle. Tip 7. Collaboration. Now, this was driving me nuts for a while. I kept seeing all of these different communities with collaborations that were looking really awesome. But whenever I tried it, it didn't seem to work. Well, there was a big reason. I wasn't good enough at the time. And that's something that you need to realize. I'm not saying, you're bad, you haven't started animation yet, you're not good enough, you can't do collaboration. No, think about it. If you see these high-quality collaborations of people animating these really complicated things and doing a good job of it, do you really think you can compare to that? That is a big problem. When a lot of people see collaborations, they think, oh, I need to join that, that's so cool. And they see trailers for stuff. But then when they actually try the animation, they realize, I am so outclassed. Because with collaborations, a lot of people submit different parts for a collaboration. Say, a free-fall collaboration, and a bunch of people submit different parts for it. The actual hosts will go through all the submitted pieces and pick and choose the ones that they like, the ones that they want in the collaboration. That's why all the collaborations look so good, because they're the best pieces that have been picked out by the host. So if you make a collaboration piece and you submit it, you're going to be all proud of yourself. I finally did it. It's awesome. You're going to watch the animation, the actual video that they make on the collaboration, and you may or may not see it in there. That can be disheartening, because then you think they just left it out. There's usually a reason. So with collaborations, usually I would wait until I've had a few years experience already. I started my first collaboration in 2018 when I started animation in 2017. So about a year after that, I actually did 2 collaborations then, and they did fairly well. I have done a few others recently, but I haven't finished many pieces in time. That's another thing, finishing them in time. And I'm actually currently hosting a collaboration right now. So recap, with collaborations, make sure that you match the skill level of the other people in the collaboration, or at least near, so you don't get completely passed over. And I would actually wait a little bit until you can find people either at your same skill level or around your skill level before you actually try something. I'm not speaking for joints, however. Joints, you can do at any skill level, and they'll even help you improve because you can actually learn from the other person's style. Tip 8, and this is a big one, community. I've actually touched on this a little bit with the CNC side. I've actually touched on this a little bit with tip 5, when in doubt, constructive criticism, or CNC as others say. When you have an animation that you're making by yourself, you don't have a third perspective to look at things, to maybe pick out little things that you missed, little mistakes, little faults, or even just test out to see if the video itself works or if something went wrong in the export. That is why community is important. If you can find an animation community or a group, friends, or even just a Discord server dedicated to it, link in the description, you can actually get other people's perspectives off your animation to bounce off little ideas or concepts, or to pick up things that you didn't notice. For example, I posted my video before, the intro for this series, and several people picked out little issues that I had. Of course, I'd already posted it, so I didn't want to go back and change it, but point stands. When someone actually points out little faults here and there, it gives you the chance to go back through and fix it to make a better quality product in the first place. Communities also allow you to join collaborations, because sometimes there are community posts or community collaborations, which you can join just by having been in that community, which is a good option. For communities that I would suggest, there's Animator Society, there's also Animation Community, there's the Animation Dojo, there's also a dedicated Pivot Animator community called the Dark Demon Discord, which I will have a link to in the description if you want to check that stuff out there. I would warn you, however, many of those animators are veterans, so they've had years of experience in all different versions, so don't be intimidated by their skill. They will only try to help you. And tip number 9, and this is another big one, burnout. When you first start animating, it is going to be very exciting. You're going to be doing all these new things. You're going to do stuff that you didn't think you could before. And it's going to be a big rush. But then either within 24 hours, sleeping on it, or a week, it will start to fall off. And then you won't know if it's going to come back or not. That is a problem. The definition of burnout, at least to me, is working on something a lot, getting really worked up about it, so much so that you burn through the energy you dedicate to it, which can be a bit of a problem. The way I like to manage burnout is to not spend too long animating. Hear me out. What do you think would happen if you spent all day, every day, for a week doing nothing but messing around with stick figures on a pure white screen? Would you not get bored of that? But if you limit your usage but keep it consistent, things will actually get better. Think about it. If you dedicate a day, or like a few hours a day, every other day to animation, you will get a consistent result without hitting burnout. Burnout happens because you spend too long with too much energy on one thing. But if you can keep that burn more drawn out, more subdued for a longer period of time, and you can draw it out, it won't fizzle out as quickly, or might not even fizzle out at all, while you're still going strong in your creative process. And finally, tip number 10, and this is a big one that a lot of you have been asking about, transparency. For the longest time, I didn't think transparency was possible either. It actually got in the way of one collaboration I was trying to do that was cross-platform. I did, however, end up contacting the creator of Pivot Animator, and he informed me that it was in fact possible. So I'm now going to show up a few examples on the screen of what a transparent animation in Pivot looks like, and I'm now going to show you how it's made. So quick example, if you just have a stick figure here, and you want him to rotate, just make a little looping animation like this, but you want the background to be transparent. Well, you see this right here, this white area back here, this is called your canvas. So if you go back here to File, and you click Set Background Color, or you can use the key combination, it brings up this menu, which then allows you to pick a color or different variants. For example, you have solid color, line art gradient, or radial gradient. Line art gradient is basically just a line. One line to another line, which is usually vertically, but you can change it around. You can also pick the different colors that you want to be gradiented, which is pretty fun. However, if you go into the color selector, there is this line, and it's got a weird checker pattern on it. That is alpha channel. So if you take this color and turn it down, that's transparent. Take this color all the way down, transparent. This color all the way down, transparent. It doesn't matter what color you have. If you turn this bar all the way down, it will be transparent. Then you hit OK, and it gives you this checkerboard. You hit Add, And it will probably ask for a name. You don't need to, just hit OK. And boom, look at that. It's the exact same color as the outside of your canvas. Oh, obviously, if you go back and forth between frames, it doesn't have that on every single frame. This is where the fun part comes in. You select this frame, hold Shift, and then click your first frame, which select all of these frames. If you then hit Ctrl-Alt-B, it will bring up the background color option. You can then select this color, drag it down, and hit OK, Add, and this. Now this is the important part. Once you have that selected on this frame, and this frame, you then need to hit the right arrow key on your keyboard. Once you do that, it will ask for this option. Set all selected frames to this background. You hit yes, and boom. Look at that. All of these animations. Look at that. All of these frames have the transparent background. Except for this one, but that's easy enough. You just hit B and you can do that. Boom. You hit S to save, or you just go forward, and boom. You now have a transparent background. It may not be obvious, but if you just go here and you go to Export, Animated GIF, and then you just say Videos, and then say here you just do Transparent Test, and hit Save. We'll ask for this option, because it's a GIF. And I'm going to have that playing on the screen. I'll have different things behind it, just to show you guys what that looks like. And voila, that's transparency. Another thing I mentioned before is what file formats will actually support transparency. Obviously, PNG sequence will support transparency, but also lossless AVI supports transparency. Windows AVI does not. Mega M4 or MP4 does not support transparency. Windows Media Player does support transparency. Windows Media Video does not. And that has been my top 10 tips that I've learned in the last 5 years. Yes, I've been doing this for 5 years, and I feel like I have been doing it for even longer. But the point stands, I've learned a good bit, and now, hopefully all of you learned a little something. If you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I will be making a Q&A video eventually, so feel free to submit those. I can get back to you. If you have questions on these tips, or you feel I didn't go into deep enough detail on one of them, feel free to ask that again in the comments, and I will get to that right away. Now stay tuned to the next video where I will talk about proper tween usage and how to be able to tell when you're overusing or underusing tweens. Until next time, see you on the other side.